The morning sun in Los Angeles was relentless, and it beat down on the sprawling city with a heat that promised another scorching day. And inside the high-end Ferrari dealership, the air was kept at a perfect cool temperature to match the coolness. Of the metal and leather on display in the showroom was a temple to speed and luxury, and the floors were polished marble that reflected the red bodies of the Italian sports cars like a mirror, and every surface gleamed, and every angle was designed to impress, and the silence in the room was heavy and expensive, and it was the kind of quiet that demands respect, and the staff moved through this space like sharks in an aquarium, and they were dressed in sharp suits. It cost more than the average person earned in a month, and they all carried themselves with an air of superiority, and they knew that they were the gatekeepers to a world that most people only dreamed of, and among them was the dealership's top salesman, and he stood near the center of the showroom with his arms crossed over his chest, and he was a man who believed he was better than everyone else, and his suit was perfectly tailored, and his watch was heavy with gold, and he surveyed his kingdom with a look of bored satisfaction. He had sold a car to a famous rapper just 2 days ago, and the commission from that sale alone was enough to cover his rent for 6 months. And he felt good about his life, and he felt powerful, and he spent his days judging people, and he decided within seconds of seeing someone whether they were worth his time, and he had no patience for anyone he deemed a tire kicker, and he hated people who came in to look without buying, and to him, people who didn't have money were invisible, and he treated them with a polite but cold indifference that was designed to make them leave, and he was proud of his ability to spot a fake, and he thought he could read people like a book, and what? He looked at the glass doors at the front of the showroom, and he checked his watch, wondering where his next big paycheck would walk in from. The city outside was busy, and traffic crawled along the streets, but inside the world was still and the red. Ferrari on the rotating turntable caught the light, and it spun slowly, showing off its curves, and it was a beautiful machine, and it was a car that promised freedom and adrenaline, and the top salesman looked at it and smiled, and he knew he could sell it to anyone if he wanted to, and he had the charm, and he had the looks, and he had the arrogance, and then the automatic. Glass doors at the entrance slid open with a soft hiss, and the chime above the door rang out, and the salesman looked up to see who had entered, and expecting to see a wealthy celebrity or a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley. Instead, a man walked in, who looked like he had just come from a camping trip in the woods, and he was dressed in a faded plaid flannel shirt that was wrinkled and old, and his pants were worn-out jeans that had holes in the knees, and they were covered in dust and on his feet. He wore a pair of beaten-up boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles, and his hair was messy and stuck out from under a dirty baseball cap, and he had a thick beard that covered much of his face, and he didn't look like he had a cent too. His name and he walked with a slow shuffle, and his hands were deep in his pockets, and he looked around the showroom with eyes that were hidden behind dark glasses, and he didn't look at the salespeople, and he just looked at the cars. The top salesman watched him enter, and he felt a wave of disgust wash over him, and he looked at his colleagues and smirked and nodded his head in the direction of the stranger, and the other salesman chuckled softly, and they all shared the same look of judgment, and they saw a man who didn't belong, and they saw a man who was wasting their oxygen. And the stranger walked past the reception desk without stopping, and he didn't acknowledge the greeter, who tried to say hello, and he just kept walking, and he moved slowly through the rows of cars, and he stopped in front of a sleek yellow convertible, and he looked at it with a quiet intensity, and he leaned down to look at the rim of the wheel, and he didn't touch the glass or the paint. And he just looked. The salesman decided he was going to have some fun, and he was bored, and he felt like entertaining himself at the expense of this stranger, and he smoothed down his suit jacket and put on a fake smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he began to walk across the showroom floor towards the man in the flannel shirt, and his shoes made a sharp clicking sound on the marble, and he walked with a swagger, and he felt confident, and he felt superior, and he knew that he was going to humiliate this guy, and he was going to make him feel small, and he wanted to show off for the other staff members, and he wanted to prove that he was the boss of this space. The stranger was now looking at a silver Ferrari that was parked near the back, and it was a rare model, and it was incredibly expensive, and the salesman walked up behind him and stood too close, and he invaded the stranger's personal space, and he didn't offer his hand, and he didn't introduce himself, and he just stood there with his arms crossed, and he waited for the man to turn around, and the stranger sensed the presence behind him, and he slowly turned around, and he pulled his hands out of his pockets, and he faced the salesman, and his face was calm, and he didn't look nervous, and he just looked curious, and he adjusted his glasses and looked the salesman in the eye. The salesman looked him up and down with a sneer, and he shook his head slightly, and he took a breath and prepared to speak, and his voice was loud, and it echoed in the quiet showroom, and he wanted the other customers to hear him, and he wanted to put on a show. And he didn't care that the customer hadn't done anything wrong, and he only cared that the customer looked poor, and he only cared about his own ego, and he saw an easy target, and he saw someone who wouldn't fight back, and he had no idea who the man in the flannel shirt really was, and he had no idea that he was about to make a mistake that would change his life forever. And he opened his mouth, and the words were ready to spill out, and he was ready to mock, and he was ready to judge. But the stranger just stood there, and quiet and calm and waiting. The man in the expensive suit decided that he had waited long enough, and he took a step closer to the stranger, and he wanted to make sure that the man understood exactly where he stood in this world, and he leaned in slightly and he put a hand on his hip, and he looked the man up and down with a sneer that was filled with disgust, and he did not try to hide his feelings, and he did not try to be polite, and he wanted to be cruel, and he felt that he had the right to be cruel because he was the one with the expensive suit, and he was the one with the job selling cars that cost more than houses. And the salesman looked around the showroom to see who was watching, and he saw a few other customers looking at them with mild interest, and he saw his colleagues smirking in the background, and this gave him even more confidence, and he felt like he was the king of this castle, and he could say whatever he wanted to. He cleared his throat loudly, and he looked the stranger in the eye, and he spoke with a loud and booming voice that was meant to carry across the room, and he wanted to embarrass the man, and he wanted everyone to hear his insults, and he told the man that he was wasting everyone's time, and he told him that this was a place for serious buyers, and he told him that people came here to buy dreams, not to look at pretty colors, and the stranger did not look away, and he did not look down at the floor, and he just stood there and listened, and he adjusted his glasses, and he looked at the salesman with a calm expression, and it was as if the insults were bouncing off him like water off a duck's back, and this calmness made the salesman even more angry, and he wanted to see a reaction, and he wanted to see the man get upset, but the man just stood there, and he looked back at the car, and he pointed at the engine cupboard. Stranger asked a simple question about the car, and he asked what the torque was on this specific model, and he asked about the horsepower, and his voice was quiet and soft, but there was intelligence in his question, and he knew about cars, and he knew what he was looking for, and the salesman laughed out loud when he heard the question, and he laughed so hard that he had to hold his stomach, and he looked at his colleagues and shook his head, and he turned back to the stranger and told him that the numbers did not matter, and he told him that details like that were for people who could actually afford to write the check, and he said that the man looked like he didn't even have enough money for a tank of gas, let alone the insurance for a car like this, and he laughed again, and the other salesman joined in the laughter, and it was a mean and hollow sound that filled the air. The salesman did not stop there, and he felt like he was on a roll, and he was enjoying the attention, and he wanted to humiliate the stranger completely, and he walked around the car, and he tapped on the glass with his knuckles, and told the man that this car was a piece of art, and he told him that it was a machine for winners, and he said that men who wore flannel shirts and dirty boots belonged in trucks, and he said that men who looked like him should be working on the cars, not buying them, and he was being incredibly rude, and he was crossing every line of professional decency, but he did not care, and he felt untouchable, and he felt that he was the one who made the rules, and he pointed towards the glass doors at the front of the showroom, and he told the man to leave, and told him that there was nothing for him here, and he told him to go down the street to the used car lot where they sold old beat-up cars for a few $100s, and he said that was more his speed. The stranger listened to all of this, and he did not say a word for a long time, and he just looked at the salesman. And there was no anger in his eyes, and there was no sadness, and there was just a quiet observation, and he looked at the man like he was studying a bug under a microscope, and he seemed curious about why the man was acting this way. He seemed confused by the cruelty, and he finally took a deep breath, and he asked the salesman again if he could please just sit in the car, and he said that he was serious about buying it, and his voice was still calm, but there was a firmness in it now, and he was not asking for permission to beg, and he was asking to be treated like a customer, and this request made. The salesman exploded with anger, could not believe that this man was still standing there, and he could not believe that he was still asking to sit in the car. And he felt like the man was mocking him, and he felt like his authority was being challenged, and he stepped forward, and he got right in the stranger's face, and he told him to get out, and he said that he was calling security if he didn't leave immediately. And he shouted that he knew the man was broke, and he shouted that he knew the man was just a dreamer, and he said that he had seen 1,000 guys like him before, and guys who wanted to touch something beautiful before they went back to their sad little. Livzeni was waving his hands around, and his face was turning red, and he was making a complete scene of himself, and the noise in the showroom stopped completely, and everyone stopped talking, and everyone stopped looking at cars, and everyone was looking at the salesman, and they were looking at him with embarrassment, and they were looking at him like he was crossing. Silence that fell over the room was heavy, and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning, and the salesman realized that he was shouting. And he realized that he was making a fool of himself, but he was too deep in it to stop now, and his ego was too big to back down, and he took a step back, and he straightened his tie, and he tried to compose himself, and he gave the stranger one last look of pure hatred, and he told him that he was done talking, and he said that he was going back to his office to call the police, and said that the man had 5 seconds to get off the property before he was dragged out. The stranger did not move, and he did not look scared, and he just looked at the salesman with those dark eyes, and he stood his ground, and he looked like a rock in the middle of a storm, and the salesman turned around to walk away, and he felt a flash of triumph, and he felt that he had won, and he felt that he had shown the stranger who was boss, and he turned his back on the man, and he started to walk towards his office, and left the stranger standing there next to the silver Ferrari, and he left him standing in the quiet, and he left him standing in the middle of the floor like a statue, and the salesman had a smile on his face as he walked away, but he did not know that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he did not know that the man in the flannel shirt was not a poor drifter, and he did not know that he was one of the most famous actors in the world, and he did not know that his life was about to change forever, and he walked away with his head held high and thinking that he was the king, and while the stranger stood behind him and watched him go. The showroom was filled with a heavy and uncomfortable silence after the salesman walked away, and the air felt thick and sticky, even though the air conditioning was blasting cold air. And the other customers in the showroom stopped looking at the cars, and they started looking at each other with confused and worried faces, and they had heard the shouting, and they had seen the salesman pointing his finger, and they had seen the cruel look on his face, and they felt bad for the stranger, but nobody wanted to say anything, and nobody wanted to get involved, and they just watched silently as the man in the flannel shirt stood there all alone, and he did not move, and he did not look upset, and he just stood next to the silver car with his hands in his pockets. And he looked at the reflection of the ceiling lights on the hood of the car, and he looked peaceful despite the chaos that had just happened. Salesman walked into his glass office at the back of the room, and he closed the door, but he left the blinds open so he could see out, and he sat down in his expensive leather chair, and he spun around once, and he felt like he had won a great battle, and he felt powerful, and he thought that he had protected the dealership from a person who did not belong there, and he looked at his computer screen, but he could not focus on the numbers, and he kept looking up to see if the stranger had left yet, and he expected to see the empty space where the man had been standing, but the man was still there, and he was looking closer at the car now, and he was bending down to look at the tires, and the salesman felt a flash of anger again, and he could not understand why the man was still there, and he felt like the man was mocking him by staying, and he felt like the stranger was trying to prove a point, and the salesman stood up, and he paced around his small office, and he watched the showroom floor, and he saw that the other customers were looking at the stranger with curiosity now, and they were looking at the salesman with disapproval. And this made the salesman even more nervous, and he decided that he had to go back out there, and he had to make the man leave for real this time. Walked out of his office and straightened his tie again, and he put on his meanest face, and he walked across the marble floor with heavy steps, and his shoes were clicking loudly again, and he did not care about being polite anymore, and he just wanted the stranger gone, and he wanted to show everyone that he was the boss. And as he walked through the showroom, he saw a young couple looking at a red car, and they stopped talking when they saw him coming, and they stepped out of his way, and they looked scared of him. And the salesman liked this, and he liked that people were scared, and he felt strong, and he walked up to the stranger and stood right behind him, and he was so close that he could smell the dusty smell of the stranger's clothes. And he tapped the man hard on the shoulder, and the stranger turned around slowly, and he took his hands out of his pockets, and he looked at the salesman without any fear, and his face was calm, and his eyes were dark and serious. Salesman started to speak again, and his voice was even louder this time, and he was shouting now, and he did not care who heard him, and he told the man that he was calling the police, and he told him that he was trespassing, and he said that he knew the man was just a loser with nothing better to do, and he said that the man was pathetic for coming in here and pretending that he could afford a lifestyle that he knew nothing about. And the salesman pointed at the door again, and he told him to get out, and he said that nobody wanted him here, and he said that the staff was laughing at him, and he said that the real customers were disgusted by him. And the salesman looked around the room, and he expected the other customers to nod their heads, and he expected them to agree with him, but they did not, and they looked away, and they looked down at their phones, and they looked at the floor, and they were embarrassed by him, and they were embarrassed that he was acting this way. But the salesman was too full of himself to notice, and he just kept yelling. Stranger listened to all of this, and want. He stood perfectly still, and he did not blink, and he did not look at the floor, and he just watched the salesman with a look that was hard to read, and he seemed sad more than anything else, and he seemed disappointed that a human being could treat another human being with so much hate. And after the salesman finished shouting, and the stranger reached up slowly and took off his dark glasses, and he folded them carefully and put them in his shirt pocket, and now his eyes were fully visible, and he looked directly at the salesman, and he spoke in a voice that was soft, but it was strong, and it cut through the air like a knife, and he asked the salesman why he was so angry, and he asked him what he had done to deserve this treatment, and he said that he just wanted to look at a car, and he said that he was a human being, just like the salesman laughed in his face, and he could not believe that the man was talking back to him, and he told him to shut up, and he told him that he was nothing, but the stranger did not stop, and he took a step closer, and he did not back down, and he looked the salesman in the eye, and he said that he was interested in buying the car, and he said that he had the money, and he asked the salesman very clearly if there was a problem with him wanting to buy the car, and he asked him why he was being judged by his clothes instead of by his character. And the question was so simple, and it was so honest, and it made the salesman freeze for a second. And the salesman opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, and he felt a strange feeling in his stomach, and it was a feeling of doubt. But he pushed it away quickly, and he was not going to let this man win. The salesman prepared to deliver the final insult, and he wanted to say something really mean, and he wanted to hurt the man's feelings, and he took a deep breath, and he raised his hand to point at the door again. But just as he was about to speak, a sound came from the front of the showroom, and it was the sound of the glass doors opening, and then came a loud gasp, and it was a gasp that came from a woman who was standing near the entrance, and it was a sound of total shock, and then another person gasped, and then a third person, and the salesman stopped with his mouth half open, and he wondered what was happening, and he turned his head to look at the door, and he saw the general manager of the dealership running, and he was running as fast as he could, and his face was pale white, and he looked terrified, and he was running straight towards them, and he ran past the salesman, and he ignored him completely, and he ran right up to the stranger, and the salesman stood there frozen, and his arms still raised in the air, and he watched in confusion as the manager skidded to a halt in front of the man in the flannel shirt, and the manager was out of breath, and he was sweating, and he looked like he had seen a ghost, and the whole room went silent, and everyone was holding their breath and waiting to see what would happen next. The general manager was running so fast that he nearly tripped over his own feet as he entered the showroom area, and his face was pale, and his eyes were wide open with panic, and he was a man who usually acted very cool and collected, but right now, he looked like he had just seen a ghost, and he ran past the customers, who were standing near the entrance, and he ignored the expensive cars that he usually loved, and his only focus was on the man standing in the worn-out flannel shirt, and he reached the small group and stopped suddenly, and he had to catch his breath, and he was breathing hard, and sweat was forming on his forehead, and reached out his hand to shake the hand of the stranger, and his hand was shaking visibly, and he spoke with a voice that was full of respect and fear, and he said, "Hello, Mr. Reeves," and he apologized profusely for not being there to greet him when he walked in. He said that he had no idea he was coming to the dealership today, and he said that if he had known, he would have closed the dealership for the day just for him. Air in the room seemed to vanish instantly, and the silence became absolute and It was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the break room down the hall, and the salesman who had been shouting just a moment ago stood frozen like a statue, and his brain stopped working for a second, and the words Mr. Reeves bounced around in his head, and he knew that name, and everyone in the world knew that name. And he looked at the face of the man standing in front of him, and the man was still calm, and he was still wearing the dirty hat, and he was still wearing the old boots, but now the salesman saw him differently, and he saw the jawline, and he saw the familiar eyes, and he realized that he was looking at one of the most famous movie stars in the history of the world, and he realized that this was the man who starred in the biggest action movies ever made, and he realized that this man was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Drained from the salesman's face, and his hands started to shake uncontrollably. His mouth went dry as cotton, and the clipboard that he was holding slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a loud slap, and the sound echoed through the showroom like a gunshot, but nobody looked at the clipboard, and everyone was looking at the salesman, and they were looking at him with disgust and pity. General Manager turned his gaze away from the movie star and looked at the salesman, and his expression changed from panic to pure rage, and his face turned red, and the veins in his neck started to stick out, and he could not believe what he was seeing, and he could not believe that his top salesman had been screaming at a celebrity, and he asked the salesman what he thought he was doing, and he asked him why he was yelling at a customer, and his voice was low and dangerous, and the salesman tried to speak, but his throat closed up, and he made a choking sound, and he tried to say that he didn't know who it was, and he tried to say that the man looked like a homeless person, but he could not get the words out, and he just stammered and stuttered, and he looked back and forth between the manager and the movie star, and he felt like he was going to faint, and he felt like the floor was opening up to swallow him whole, and the reality of his situation started to sink in. He had just insulted one of the most beloved and powerful men on the planet, and he had just thrown away his career in a fit of arrogance, and he felt sick to his stomach. Movie star did not look angry, and he did not look like he wanted to get anyone in trouble, and he just looked tired, and he shook the hand of the manager and gave him a small, polite smile, and he told the manager that it was okay, and he said that he was used to people judging him by his appearance, and said that he actually preferred it when people didn't recognize him because he just wanted to live a normal life. And his voice was soft and kind, and it was the voice of a gentleman, and this made the salesman feel even worse. And if the movie star had yelled at him, it would have been easier to take an MB. But seeing how nice he was made the salesman realize just how mean he had been, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him, and it was a physical feeling that made his skin hot, and he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him, and he wanted to run out of the showroom and never come back. But his feet were glued to the floor, and he had to stand there and face the consequences of his actions. The customers in the showroom were whispering to each other now, and they had pulled out their phones, and they were taking pictures and videos of the scene, and they were trying to be sneaky about it, but they were excited to see a real celebrity standing there in their midst, and the sales associates who had laughed earlier were now hiding behind cars, and they were pretending to be busy, and they didn't want to be associated with the salesman who had messed up so badly. And the manager turned back to the movie star, and his face changed back to a look of total adoration, and he asked him what he could do for him, and he asked him if he wanted to test drive a car, and he offered him water or coffee or anything he wanted, and he was bending over backwards to be nice, and it was a completely different vibe from just 5 minutes ago, and the movie star pointed at the silver Ferrari, and he said that he was actually interested in that car, and he said that he had been looking for one for his collection, and he said that he liked the way the engine sounded. Dev Manager beamed with happiness, and he was thinking about the huge commission, and he was thinking about the publicity of selling a car to this star, and he unlocked the car door immediately. And he opened it with a flourish, and he bowed slightly, and he invited the star to sit inside. And the movie star thanked him, and he put one foot on the carpet, but then he stopped, and he turned around and looked at the salesman one last time, and the salesman was standing there with sweat dripping down his nose, and he looked like a child who had been scolded, and he looked terrified, and the movie star looked at him with those deep, dark eyes, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't smile, and he didn't frown, and he just looked at him for a long moment, and the silence stretched out, and it felt like an eternity, and the salesman felt like he was being judged by a god, and he knew that he had failed the test, and he knew that he had shown his true colors, and they were ugly. And the movie star turned back to the car, and he sat down in the leather seat, and the silence was broken by the sound of the door clicking shut, and it was a final sound, and it sounded like a door closing on the salesman's career, and the salesman stood there, shaking and wondering what would happen next, and he knew that his life was never going to be the same, and he had let his ego ruin everything, and now he had to pay the price. The silence stretched on, and nobody moved, and the movie star sat in the driver's seat, and he ran his hand over the steering wheel, and he looked at the dashboard with the eyes of someone who truly loved machines. And the manager stood outside the but a big, hopeful smile on his face, and he was already planning his speech, and was thinking about how much money this sale would bring to the dealership, but the salesman stood frozen in the middle of the floor, and his legs felt like lead weights. And he could hear his own heart beating in his ears, and it was a fast and heavy thumping sound, and he watched the actor, and he prayed for a miracle, and he hoped that the actor would just buy the car and leave, and he hoped that everything would go back to normal. But deep down he knew that was impossible. Actor took a deep breath, and he looked at the manager through the open window, and he spoke quietly, and he said that it was a beautiful car, and he said that it drove incredibly well, and the manager nodded his head eagerly, and he agreed with everything, and he told the actor that he had excellent taste, and the actor turned his head then, and looked straight at the salesman, and his gaze was heavy, and it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the salesman's chest, and the actor spoke to the manager, but his eyes stayed on the salesman, and he said that he was actually ready to buy this car today, and said that he was looking for something to drive on the weekends, and the salesman let out a breath that he did not know he was holding, and he thought maybe he was safe, and he thought maybe he was off the hook, but then the actor continued speaking, paused for a moment, and he looked down at the leather seats, and he said that he did not like the way he was treated when he walked in, and he said that he did not like the way the staff treated people who did not look rich, and he said that money was not everything, and he said that respect was more important than a suit, and his voice was not loud, but it carried across the room, and everyone heard him clearly, and the customers who were watching stopped recording their videos for a second, and they just listened, and they felt the truth in his words, and the actor turned back to the manager, and he shook his head slowly. And he said that he could not give his money to a place that allowed such behavior, and he said that he was going to take his business elsewhere. Manager's face fell, and his smile disappeared in a flash, and he looked terrified again, and he started to beg, and he told the actor that it was a mistake, and he said that the salesman was new, and he lied, and he said that the salesman would be fired immediately, and he tried to apologize on behalf of the whole company, but the actor was already opening the car door, and he stepped out of the car with a slow, deliberate movement, and he smoothed his flannel shirt, and he did not look angry, and he just looked firm, and he told the manager that it was too late, and he said that first impressions were important, and he said that this was his first impression, and he put his glasses back on, and he thanked the manager for his time, and he turned to walk away. Salesman stood there watching him go, and he felt like his world was crumbling around him, and he saw the millions of dollars walking out the door, and he saw his reputation walking out the door, and he wanted to run after the actor, and he wanted to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness, but his feet were still stuck to the floor, and he was paralyzed by his own shame. And the actor walked past the other customers, and they nodded at him with respect, and some of them whispered his name, and he did not stop, and he walked with his hands in his pockets and his head down, and just a regular guy leaving a shop, and he pushed the glass door open and walked out into the bright California sun, and the door slid shut behind him with a soft click as soon as the actor was gone. The atmosphere in the showroom changed completely, and the manager turned around slowly, and he looked like an angry bull, and his face was purple with rage, and he glared at the salesman, and the other staff members backed away, and they did not want to get caught in the crossfire. And the manager marched over to the salesman, and he got right in his face, and he did not hold back anymore, and he started shouting again. But this time he was shouting at the salesman, and he called him an idiot, and he called him a disgrace, and he told him that he had just cost the dealership a huge sale, and he told him that he had made them look like fools on the internet, and he said that people were already posting the video online, and he said that the reviews would be terrible. Salesman tried to speak, and he tried to explain that he didn't know who it was, and he tried to say that he was just doing his job, but the manager cut him off, and he said that it did not matter who it was. And he said that you treat everyone with respect, and he said that was the most basic rule of sales, and he told the salesman that he was fired, and he said it loud and clear for everyone to hear, and he told him to take off his badge, and he told him to get out of his sight, and he told him to leave the building immediately, and the salesman felt like he had been punched in the stomach, and he stood there for a moment with his mouth open, and he looked at his coworkers, but nobody would look at him, and they all turned their backs, and they pretended to be busiest. Slowly the salesman reached up and unpinned his name tag from his jacket, and his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it on the floor, and he bent down to pick it up, and he felt small, and he felt pathetic, and he stood up one last time, and he looked at the empty spot where the movie star had been standing, and he looked at the silver car that was now sitting there alone, and he realized that his pride had cost him everything, and he had judged a book by its cover, and he had been cruel to a good man, and now he had nothing left to show for it, and he turned and walked towards the exit, and his footsteps were slow and heavy, and he did not look at the luxury cars anymore, and he did not look at the customers, and he just kept his eyes on the floor, and he pushed the door open and stepped out into the heat, and the door slid shut behind him, and sealing him out of that world forever, and the story was over, and the lesson was learned, and the salesman was just a memory in a showroom of dreams.